They refused her first-class seat, not knowing she owned the company asterisk. The morning sun filtered through the massive windows of Denver International Airport as passengers hurried toward their gates. Among them walked Victoria Hayes, a woman whose simple black dress and comfortable flats gave no hint of the empire she commanded. At 52, Victoria had built Skybridge Airlines from a single regional route into one of America's most profitable carriers. Today, she was traveling incognito on her own airline, conducting what she called a reality check, experiencing her company as an ordinary passenger would. Victoria approached Gate 15, where Flight 847 to Chicago was boarding. She held her first-class ticket in hand. Printed under the name Victoria H. Martinez, her grandmother's maiden name, which she occasionally used for privacy. The gate agent, a stern-looking woman named Patricia Knox, barely glanced up as Victoria presented her boarding pass. "Economy passengers boarding Group 4, Patricia announced coldly, not bothering to examine the ticket properly. "Actually, this is first class," Victoria replied politely, extending the boarding pass closer. Patricia's eyes narrowed as she snatched the ticket. Her expression shifted to one of barely concealed disdain as she studied Victoria's modest appearance. "Ma'am, I think there's been some mistake. This ticket doesn't match our premium passenger profile." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Victoria felt a familiar knot form in her stomach. The same feeling she'd experienced countless times throughout her career when people underestimated her based on her appearance, her gender, or her background. But this time was different. This was her airline, her employees, her standards being violated right before her eyes. "I'd like to speak with your supervisor," Victoria said calmly, her voice carrying an authority that made nearby passengers turn their heads. Patricia's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Mrs. Rodriguez will tell you the same thing. First class is for our valued customers, not." She paused, her eyes scanning Victoria from head to toe, not everyone. The implication was clear, and Victoria felt her jaw tighten. Other passengers began to notice the commotion. A young businessman in an expensive suit brushed past Victoria without a second glance, his own first-class ticket whisking him through without question. The contrast wasn't lost on anyone watching Mrs. Isabella Rodriguez. The gate supervisor appeared with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to handling difficult situations. Her silver hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her uniform was immaculate. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who had worked for Skybridge Airlines for over 15 years. "What seems to be the problem here?" Isabella asked, her tone professional but cool. Patricia quickly launched into her explanation. "This passenger is trying to use a first-class ticket, but I don't believe it's legitimate. She doesn't fit our usual premium customer demographic." Victoria watched Isabella's face carefully. Would her own supervisor, someone she had personally promoted just 2 years ago, recognize the discrimination happening right before her eyes? The answer came swiftly and disappointingly. "I see," Isabella said, barely glancing at Victoria's ticket. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see some additional identification. Premium seating requires verification for security purposes." Victoria's heart sank. This wasn't just one employee's prejudice. It was a systemic problem that had somehow infected her company culture. She reached into her purse and pulled out her driver's license. Handing it over with steady hands, despite the rage building inside her, Isabella examined the ID with theatrical thoroughness, holding it up to the light and comparing it to Victoria's face multiple times. "Victoria Martinez," she read aloud. "And you're telling me you purchased a first-class ticket?" "That's correct," Victoria replied, her voice remaining steady despite the humiliation. The supervisor's expression grew more skeptical. "Mrs. Martinez, I'm going to need to call our security team. There have been several incidents recently of fraudulent tickets, and we take these matters very seriously." As Isabella reached for her radio, Victoria made a decision that would change everything. She pulled out her phone and sent a quick text message to her chief operating officer. "Emergency meeting. Conference room, A now. Security Officer David." Park arrived within minutes, his uniform crisp and his demeanor professional. Victoria had hired David personally after his exemplary service record in airport security at LAX. Now, as he approached with handcuffs visible on his belt, She wondered if he would recognize the injustice unfolding before him. "What's the situation?" David asked, his voice neutral, but his eyes already sizing up Victoria as a potential threat. Isabella jumped in before Victoria could speak. This passenger is attempting to board with what appears to be a fraudulent first-class ticket. She doesn't have proper verification, and her appearance doesn't match our premium customer profile. David's expression hardened. Victoria watched her own employee, someone she had personally ensured received fair wages and excellent benefits, prepare to treat her as a criminal. The irony was almost unbearable. "I'm going to need you to step aside while we verify your ticket," David said, his hand moving instinctively toward his radio. "This is standard procedure for suspicious activity." Victoria's mind raced. She could reveal her identity right now, end this humiliation with a simple phone call. But something deeper was at stake here. If this was happening to her, the owner of the company, what was happening to other passengers who didn't have her resources or authority? "I understand your procedures," Victoria said carefully, "but I'd like to know what specifically makes my ticket suspicious." "I've provided valid identification, and the ticket was purchased through your official website." Patricia scoffed from behind the counter. "Anyone can fake a ticket these days. It's obvious you don't belong in first class." The crowd around them grew larger. Other passengers began pulling out their phones, some recording the interaction. Victoria noticed a young reporter from Channel 7 News, Rachel Thompson, who was apparently traveling on the same flight. Rachel's camera was discreetly positioned, capturing every moment. David looked uncomfortable, but proceeded with protocol. "Ma'am, I need to ask you some questions. How did you afford a first-class ticket? What's your occupation? Are you traveling for business or pleasure?" Victoria felt the weight of every discriminatory assumption packed into those questions. "I don't believe my financial situation or occupation is relevant to my right to board this flight with a valid ticket." Isabella stepped forward, her voice rising. "We have the right to refuse service to anyone who cannot properly verify their identity or ticket legitimacy. Mrs. Martinez, you're going to need to cooperate or we'll have to ask you to leave the gate area." The situation was spiraling out of control. Victoria watched as her own employees violated every principle of customer service and basic human dignity that she had tried to instill in her company. She thought about the countless meetings where she had emphasized treating every passenger with respect, regardless of their background or appearance. "I'd like to speak with your regional manager," Victoria said firmly. "This treatment is unacceptable." Patricia laughed openly now. "The regional manager isn't going to change anything. You still won't belong in first class." David moved closer, his hand now resting on his handcuffs. "Ma'am, you need to calm down, or I'll have to restrain you for disturbing the peace." Victoria felt the walls closing in. Round her, passengers whispered and pointed. Some looked sympathetic, others seemed convinced she was indeed trying to scam her way into premium seating. The assumptions, the prejudice, the casual cruelty, it was all happening in her own airline. Under her own leadership, Rachel Thompson stepped forward, her press badge clearly visible. "Excuse me, I'm with Channel 7 News. Can you tell me what's happening here?" Isabella's face went pale. "This is a private security matter. Please step back." But Rachel was persistent. "Are you refusing to allow this passenger to board despite her having a valid ticket? What specific policy are you citing?" Victoria watched, the interaction with growing fascination. Finally, someone was asking the right questions. Patricia and Isabella exchanged nervous glances, suddenly realizing that their actions were being scrutinized by the media. "We're following standard security protocols," David said defensively. "This passenger has raised several red flags." "What red flags?" Rachel pressed. "Can you be specific?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Victoria could see the exact moment when her employees realized they had no legitimate answer, only their biases and assumptions. As Rachel Thompson's questions grew more pointed, Victoria noticed her chief operating officer, Michael Chen, approaching the gate with two other executives. Michael's face was grim as he surveyed the scene, his boss being harassed by their own employees while passengers recorded the entire interaction. "What exactly is happening here?" Michael asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Isabella straightened immediately, recognizing the executive. "Mr. Chen, We have a situation with a passenger attempting to board with questionable documentation. Michael's eyes found Victoria's, and she gave him the slightest shake of her head. Not yet. She needed to see how far this would go, how deep. The problem ran in her organization, I see, Michael said slowly. And what makes the documentation questionable? Patricia stepped forward eagerly. Sir, this passenger doesn't fit our premium customer profile. She's clearly not someone who would normally purchase first-class tickets. The words hung in the air like a confession. Michael's expression darkened. As he processed the blatant discrimination, Victoria watched her crew struggle with the decision of whether to intervene or allow the situation to continue. Rachel Thompson continued filming. Oh, her journalistic instincts sensing a major story. Can you explain what you mean by it doesn't fit the profile? Are you saying Skybridge Airlines has specific requirements for first-class passengers beyond purchasing a ticket? Spella looked trapped. We have security protocols. What security? Protocols? Rachel pressed. Are you saying this passenger poses a security threat? Based on what evidence? David shifted uncomfortably. As a trained security professional, he knew the questions he had asked were inappropriate and potentially discriminatory. But he had followed the lead of his supervisors, assuming they knew something he did. Victoria decided it was time to take control. I'd like to call my attorney, she said clearly, pulling out her phone. This treatment appears to be discriminatory, and I want it documented properly. The word attorney sent a visible shockwave through the airline employees. Patricia's face went white, and Isabella began frantically whispering into her radio. Michael stepped closer to Victoria. Ma'am, perhaps we can resolve this without involving lawyers. I'm Michael Chen, Chief Operating Officer of Skybridge Airlines. Can you tell me exactly what happened? Victoria looked at her coup, a man she had mentored, promoted, and trusted, and made her decision. Mr. Chen, I purchased a first-class ticket through your website. One presented valid identification. Your employees have refused to honor my ticket based solely on their assumption that I don't fit the profile of a premium passenger. Michael's jaw tightened. And what profile would that be? Isabella tried to interrupt. Sir, we were just following protocol. ... Double quotes. What protocol? Michael's voice was sharp now. We don't have protocols that allow discrimination based on appearance or assumptions about passengers' financial status. The crowd around them had grown significantly.
How?
Other passengers were openly recording now. And Victoria could see several people live streaming the confrontation on social media. The hashtag Skybridge discrimination was already trending. Rachel Thompson seized the moment. Mr. Chen, are you saying that Skybridge Airlines employees violated company policy? Michael looked directly at Victoria, a question in his eyes. She nodded slightly. It was time. It's more than that, Michael said carefully. They've potentially violated federal anti-discrimination laws, and they've done so too. ... He paused, looking at Victoria again. To someone who deserves not just an apology, but immediate action. Patricia looked confused. I don't understand. Who is she? Victoria stood up slowly, her posture changing from that of a harassed passenger to the confident bearing of someone. Accustomed to command? My name is Victoria Hayes, she said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the gate area. I'm the founder and CEO of Skybridge Airlines. The silence that followed was deafening. Tricia's face went from white to green. Isabella dropped her radio. David stared in horror at the handcuffs he had been prepared to use on his own boss. Rachel. Thompson's camera captured every moment of the revelation. The shock on the employees' faces, the murmurs of amazement from the crowd. This was no longer just a story about discrimination. It was a story about a CEO discovering the ugly truth. About her own company. The revelation sent shockwaves through the gate area. Passengers who had been watching the confrontation unfold now realized they had witnessed something unprecedented. A CEO being discriminated against by her own employees. The irony was not lost on anyone present. Patricia Knox stood frozen, her face cycling through confusion, recognition, and finally terror. The woman she had dismissed so casually, whose ticket she had questioned, whose very presence in first class she had challenged, was her ultimate boss. The person who signed her paychecks and had the power to end her career with a single word. This can't be happening. Patricia whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. Isabella Rodriguez, the supervisor who had called for security, felt her legs weaken. 15 years with the company, a perfect record, commendations for customer service. All of it potentially destroyed by 30 minutes of prejudice and poor judgment. She had looked Victoria Hayes in the eye and treated her like a criminal. David Park slowly moved his hand away from his handcuffs. The weight of his actions settling on him like a physical burden, had prepared to arrest the woman who had personally approved his hiring, who had implemented the security protocols he was sworn to uphold. The betrayal of trust was complete. Michael Chen stepped forward, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to address what just happened here. What you witnessed was completely unacceptable and goes against every value Skybridge Airlines stands for. Victoria held up her hand, signaling for silence. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being heard, but also the pain of someone who had been deeply hurt by people she trusted. I want everyone to understand something, Victoria began. What happened here today didn't happen because these employees are inherently bad people. It happened because somewhere in our training, in our culture, in our systems, we failed to instill the basic principle that every passenger deserves respect and dignity. Rachel Thompson continued filming, recognizing that this was evolving into something much bigger than a simple discrimination story. This was a CEO having a moment of reckoning with her own company's culture. Mrs. Hayes, Rachel interjected, what do you think went wrong here? Victoria looked around at the crowd, at her employees, at the cameras recording her every word. We created a culture where assumptions about people's worth are based on their appearance, their clothing, their perceived social status. We trained our employees to look for red flags without teaching them to recognize their own biases. Patricia found her voice, desperation creeping in. Mrs. Hayes, I didn't know. I was just trying to do my job to protect the airline from fraud. Victoria's gaze was steady, but not unkind. Patricia, tell me exactly what made you think I was committing fraud. Was it the validity of my ticket? My identification? Or was it something else? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Patricia's mouth opened and closed several times before she could answer. Your clothes. You didn't look like... Like what? Victoria pressed gently. Like someone who could. Afford first class. Like someone who belongs in premium seating. Like someone who deserves basic respect. Isabella stepped forward, tears beginning to form in her eyes. Mrs. Hayes, I'm so sorry. I've worked for this company for 15 years and I thought I was being professional. Isabella, Victoria said, her voice softening slightly. You called security on a passenger with a valid ticket because she didn't fit your mental image of who deserves first-class treatment? That's not professionalism, that's discrimination. Michael. Chen looked at his boss with a mixture of admiration and concern. He knew Victoria was handling this situation with more grace than many CEOs would, but he also knew the legal and public relations implications were enormous. Mrs. Hayes, Michael said carefully, perhaps we should discuss next steps privately. Victoria shook her head. No, Michael, this needs to be public. These passengers, this reporter, everyone here, they need to see how we handle this. They need to know that discrimination has consequences. She turned to face David Park, who had been standing silently, his face a mask of shame and regret. David, you were prepared to handcuff me. You asked me about my occupation, my financial situation, my right to be in first class. Do you understand why those questions were inappropriate? David's voice was barely above a whisper. Yes, ma'am. There was no legitimate security reason for those questions. I was making assumptions. Based on what? Victoria asked. David looked up, meeting her eyes for the first time since the revelation. Based on prejudice, ma'am. Based on stereotypes I thought I had overcome. Victoria nodded slowly. At least you're honest. That's the first step toward change. Addressed the crowd that had gathered, her voice carrying clearly through the gate area. I want everyone here to know that what happened today is not what Skybridge Airlines stands for, but it is what we became when we stopped paying attention to our own values. Rachel Thompson raised her camera higher. Mrs. Hayes, what are you going to do about this? Victoria looked at her three employees, Patricia, Isabella, and David, who had treated her with such disrespect and discrimination. Their careers, their livelihoods, their futures hung in the balance of her next words. Victoria Hayes stood at the center of the gate area, surrounded by passengers, employees, and cameras, holding the weight of a moment that would define not just her company's future, but potentially influence how the entire airline industry handled discrimination. The silence was heavy with expectation. "I want to be very clear about something," Victoria began, her voice carrying across the crowded space. "What happened here today was wrong. It was discriminatory, it was hurtful, and it violated every principle I thought we had instilled in this company." Patricia Knox's hands trembled as she waited for the verdict on her career. Isabella Rodriguez had tears streaming down her face. David Park stood at attention, accepting whatever consequences were coming. But Victoria continued, "I'm not going to fire anyone today." Statement sent a ripple of surprise through the crowd. Rachel Thompson's eyebrows raised, and Michael Chen looked at his boss with curiosity. "You're not?" Patricia asked, her voice barely audible. Victoria shook her head. "Firing you would be the easy solution. It would make for good headlines. It would satisfy the public's desire for justice. And it would let me pretend that this was just about 3 bad employees rather than a systemic problem." She walked closer to her employees, her voice becoming more personal. "Patricia, you have 2 children and a mortgage. Isabella, you're supporting your elderly mother. David, you just got married last month. Destroying your lives won't undo the discrimination that happened here, and it won't prevent it from happening again." Victoria turned to face the cameras and the crowd. "Instead, we're going to do something harder. We're going to change." Pulled out her phone and began typing. "I'm sending a message to every Skybridge Airlines employee in the country. Effective immediately. We're implementing a company-wide bias training program. Every employee, from baggage handlers to executives, will participate." Michael Chen stepped forward. "Mrs. Hayes, I should coordinate this with our HR department." "No," Victoria said firmly. "This isn't going to be handled by HR. This is going to be handled by me, personally. I'm going to visit every hub, every training center, every office. I'm going to talk to our employees about what happened here today." She looked back at Patricia, Isabella, and David. "You 3 are going to help me. You're going to share your experience, your mistakes, your learning process. You're going to help train other employees to recognize bias before it becomes discrimination." Isabella wiped her eyes. "Mrs. Hayes, why are you giving us this chance? We didn't deserve." "Because," Victoria interrupted, "everyone deserves a chance to learn from their mistakes. And because I believe that people who have experienced the consequences of prejudice can become the most effective advocates against it." Rachel Thompson seized the moment. "Mrs. Hayes, this is a very unusual response. Many people will expect firings, lawsuits, traditional consequences." Victoria smiled slightly. "Rachel, I've been in business for 30 years. I've learned that fear-based solutions don't create lasting change. If we fire these employees, others will just learn to hide their biases better. If we help them grow, they can help others grow too." She turned to address the crowd of passengers who had witnessed the entire incident. "I want to apologize to everyone here. You came to fly with Skybridge Airlines, and instead you witnessed discrimination and unprofessionalism. That's not the company I built, and it's not the company you deserve." A passenger near the back of the crowd raised her hand. "Mrs. Hayes, how do we know this will actually change anything?" Victoria nodded appreciatively. "That's a fair question. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm creating a passenger advocacy position, a vice president level role reporting directly to me. Their job will be to investigate complaints, review policies, and ensure that every passenger is treated with dignity and respect." She looked at Rachel Thompson. "And I'm inviting the media to follow up on our progress. 6 months from now, I want you to come back and see if we've lived up to our commitments." Patricia found her voice again. "Mrs. Hayes, I don't know what to say. I was so wrong about you, about everything." Victoria placed a gentle hand on Patricia's shoulder. "Patricia, you weren't wrong about me personally. You were wrong about the assumption that someone's worth is determined by their appearance or perceived social status. That's what we need to change." She turned to David. "And David, I want you to head up our security bias training. Who better to teach officers about inappropriate assumptions than someone who has learned from making them?" David stood straighter. "Yes, ma'am. I won't let you down. You already have," Victoria said with a slight smile. "The question is, what you do next?" Michael Chen approached with a tablet. "Mrs. Hayes, the story is already going viral. We're getting calls from news outlets. Passengers are posting videos, and our stock price is fluctuating." Victoria looked at the screen, seeing hashtags like hashtag Skybridge discrimination and hashtag CEO discrimination trending worldwide. Good, let people see what happened. Let them see how we respond. Transparency is the first step toward accountability. She turned back to the crowd one final time. "I want everyone to know that this flight will be delayed while we process what happened here. Anyone who wants to change their travel plans will receive a full refund and a voucher for future travel. Anyone who chooses to stay will be upgraded to first class, regardless of their original ticket." A cheer went up from the crowd. Victoria raised her hand for silence. "But understand this. The upgrade isn't an apology for what happened. It's a promise of what comes next. Every passenger on every flight deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. That's not an upgrade. That's a basic right." The crowd began to disperse. Rachel Thompson approached Victoria one final time. "Mrs. Hayes, any final thoughts?" Victoria looked around the gate area at her employees who were beginning to understand the magnitude of their actions, at the passengers who had witnessed corporate accountability in real time, at the cameras that had captured it all. "Change is hard," she said simply, "but it's necessary. What happened here today wasn't just about one flight or 3 employees. It was about the assumptions we make, the biases we carry, and the courage required to confront them." She paused. Looking directly into the camera, I challenge every company, every leader, every person watching this to examine their own biases. Don't wait for a moment like this to realize that discrimination is happening under your watch. Act now, before someone else gets hurt. As Victoria finally boarded her own plane, taking her rightful seat in first class, she reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. She had set out to conduct a simple audit of her company's customer service. Instead, she had discovered and hopefully begun to address a much deeper problem. The flight took off on schedule, with every passenger in first class, and Victoria Hayes beginning the most important work of her career, ensuring that no one else would ever experience what she had experienced that day,